Hello, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Welcome to Sustainable Outlook. I'm Elizabeth Crouse, partner and co-lead of the Power Group at K&L Gates. In this episode, the first of a two-part series, I interview Clarita Montant of Acorn International, who works with a variety of companies to help them engage on the intersection of social and environmental issues through risk analysis and community engagement around challenging issues, particularly in the traditional energy community. Clarita has extensive experience in human rights and capacity building with particular talents in international settings. Clarita, thanks so much for joining us today. To kick things off, could you please tell us a little bit about why human rights is a concern in the energy industry?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, first of all, and thanks for having us with my colleague Grace in this podcast. So human rights, I think human rights in general, I would start by saying, are and should be a concern in every industry and for all businesses. Just celebrated the 10th year anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the first international instrument that assigns companies the responsibility to respect human rights. And so we've seen a lot of talk about it. I think also with COVID, the pandemic really highlighted the fragility of the supply chain, which is where a lot of human rights issues came out of the dark. And people, consumers in general, and then subsequently companies have just become more aware of these issues in the workforce. But why does it matter in the energy industry? I think the quick and easy answer would be to say because the energy industry has such a wide impact worldwide, really everywhere. And because the operations, vary greatly and their impacts also vary greatly. So that is why I think human rights are so important in the energy industry. I think, speaking a little bit more about the supply chain, because this is such a hot topic lately, and especially with COVID, for companies to be able to keep an eye, if I can say, on their supply chain and their suppliers, and to make sure that they have robust auditing systems in place so that human rights are protected and labor rights are protected has been very difficult, but it's also been really important. We were in a time for the past year and a half where no one could travel really far. And so it's been difficult for companies to really be able to check in on their suppliers and make sure that everything is done with the standards that they're used to working. I think also the pandemic has highlighted some other issues. Obviously, there are issues of gender equity within the workforce, which is, completely separate, also part of the supply chain issues, but also, separate from it. And those issues, I saw a study recently that said that 1 in 4 women is considering leaving the workforce as a result to COVID because they've had to take care of the children and the house more. So that has also become a very important concern, I think, that companies are wanting to tackle.
Thank you. I think many countries have had laws around human rights for a number of years, right? This isn't new, as you pointed out. The UN's always focused on human rights, especially in the last 10 years. But we've seen something of a spike in interest in some places, anyway, in the last few years around human rights. For example, Australia very famously passed a couple of years ago the Modern Slavery Act. At the same time, we've also seen some corporate actors begin to take a much more active role in monitoring their supply chains pretty deeply, and other kinds of voluntary compliance with standards and things along those lines. As a consultant, when do you get involved? Why are clients coming to you in respect of human rights in the energy industry?
So that's a great question. And actually, companies come to us at very different stages in their processes. So I'll give you a few examples to illustrate my answer. You mentioned the legislation that has been put in place, and indeed in the past few years, there's been a surge in countries that implement legislation. There's actually currently a proposal at the European level that would enforce or require human rights and environmental due diligence for all large companies operating within the European Union territory. So there's really been a spike in these legislations, and it seems, with the UNGPs turning 10 and these increase in legislation, that we're kind of moving from voluntary action to accountability. So when do companies come to us? The first example I'll give is one actually in Australia in relation to the Australia's Modern Slavery Act that you mentioned. And so we had a company who's based in Australia and that has to report under the Modern Slavery Act that contracted us to do an assessment of one of their suppliers that was located in Brazil. They weren't sure of the suppliers' practices. And so they wanted us as independent consultants to, go on the ground, see what's going on, and really give them an independent, transparent report about it so that they could ensure, that then when they report under the Modern Slavery Act back in Australia, that they were in line with that act. So that was a really interesting project. And that's one way that companies, can contract us. Another way to do it, and I think this has been a big one actually over the past, decade, and that is through investors. The pressure that investors put on, other companies or the projects that they invest in is really, really important in terms of human rights and environmental due diligence. And so, for instance, we work with banks oftentimes that invest in certain projects. We had a project recently in the Dominican Republic, and before any disbursement is made, they contract us again as independent consultants to do an environmental and social due diligence exercise and to ensure that, everything is in place for the project to go forward. And when it's not, of course, we work with them to provide recommendations and things like that. So I think those are two of the different stages at which companies can contract us to help them with their due diligence.
Clarita, you mentioned that a lot of your role and a lot of the engagements come down to diligence efforts. How do you approach the process of diligencing human rights practices? And once you're done, what's the typical outcome?
So, the quick answer is it varies, right? It varies depending on the project and depending on what we're looking for. But I think overall, the way we approach the process is really to conduct our own diligence by doing some research, desktop research. We would also do interviews with stakeholders, with people, internal and external stakeholders, and prepare a report with recommendations. And I think this is where the most important part comes in, which is the recommendations that we would make. So in quite a few of the projects we work in, we are also contracted to help implement those recommendations. So for instance, referring back to the example in Australia under the Modern Slavery Act, our client contracted us to work with their supplier to ensure that the recommendations we had made to them were being implemented. And this is a really interesting part of our work, I think, because we have to use the leverage that we have or don't have to ensure that these recommendations are being implemented, to ensure that these companies, are respecting human rights. But at the same time, we don't want to ruin any relationships, commercial relationships between our client and their supplier, right? That's not our role. So we really try to find the best middle ground possible for the supplier to still implement recommendations, do a better job at respecting human rights, and, just overall better the way in which they work, so that also it falls under the framework of the national legislation of our client, but at the same time, not pushing too much to where the supplier is just going to say, well, I don't want to do any of this, and I'm just going to go find another client. So it's a really interesting part of the work, and I think it's a part of the work that really differs completely depending on who we're working with, where we're working with. So it's always different, but it's still, I think, also where most of the action happens, in my opinion.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think it sounds to me like what you're really saying is that you want to actually make a difference. You want to help your clients actually make a difference. And maybe the best way to do that is to balance it, balance the action, balance the response with the commercial relationship so that you can actually create some change. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly it. We want to make sure that change does happen, and sometimes in the recommendations that we provide, we are realistic but also idealistic, and we want them to meet international standards and all of that. And so then in the implementation, we want to stay realistic because, like you said, we want to push for change and ensure something happens.
Well, in shaping commercial relationships too, I mean, it can be difficult, right? Particularly as a consultant, because you're not embedded deeply into a company necessarily. And there are also a lot of other moving pieces like contracts and other
Mm-hmm.
aspects of the supply chain and making sure that they can actually, make whatever their end product is. So I guess that kind of raises the question of, what are the limitations here? At what point does it make sense to complement your work with work done by other professionals?
So I'll talk a little bit about the model that we use at Acorn International, and that is that no matter where we are in the world, we always partner with the local professionals. So we have the international expertise. We have kind of like an innate benchmarking in our heads because of the different projects we've worked on all over the world, but we don't pretend to know or understand the culture and even maybe the politics a little bit better than someone who lives and work in the country where we may have a project. So one answer to that is that we really always partner with local consultants on the ground. We have partners in over 70 countries right now, and we continue different partners as well, sometimes more focused on social issues or environmental issues, and we call them anytime because we always want to have their input and ensure that that local perspective is included in our work. I think at the same time, as you said, sometimes we need other professionals, attorneys that we need to work with, or attorneys that want to work with us, maybe because they don't have either the capacity or maybe experience to do the research and kind of the groundwork with the interviews and field trips and field visits and all of that. So that also happens. When do we do it? I think it depends. Again, for this example in Australia, as part of the recommendations, we also helped ensure that there was robust language in the contracts with their suppliers so that our client in Australia, could feel a little bit more secure about what they had in there, knowing that, of course, contracts are not our forte. We're not attorneys, but they had an attorney in-house and other attorneys that they were working for that could correct that. So we could give them, kind of the best practice experience that we had for those kind of contracts. And then for the legality and the legal terms that needed to be included, they could do that on the other hand with other professionals. In reference to our local partners, I have to say, and really any other professional, but in particular the local partners that we usually work with, I think that model of work, which our founder and president, Dean Slocum, put in place from the beginning, when he started the company, but that model of work really showed to be useful and robust during COVID, because during COVID, like I mentioned earlier, we couldn't travel to do field missions or companies couldn't audit their suppliers and things like that. But we had that network of people that were on the ground and were able to, when it was safe, of course, do that work for us and then report, and we knew we could trust them. So I just wanted to highlight that because I thought it was really important and it, was useful for our clients.
Definitely. It sounds like it's very much a group effort. I mean, particularly with what you're doing, right? There are cultural differences, there are different practices in different localities, and having that local presence, having that local contact would be hugely important, I'm sure. So we usually end these podcasts with a question about what the interviewee thinks we will all be talking about in 3 years in regard to sustainability. But sustainability is a really big topic, right? And also, we're at an interesting point in the energy industry right now because of the laser focus on Xinjiang in the solar industry. It's gotten a lot of press, a lot of attention from legislators even. So I'd like to do a small twist on the usual question today and just really focus on the energy industry specifically, and moreover about human rights. So what do you think the energy industry will be focusing on in regard to human rights specifically in 3 years?
That's a tough question because I think there are many answers. And so I'll try to keep it, somewhat short and brief. But you mentioned legislation. I think legislation is going to affect every industry. It is also going to affect the energy industry. And I think that's something that's not going to go away. Just a few weeks ago, Norway implemented legislation for human rights and environmental due diligence. Like I said earlier, the European Union is working on a proposal as well. So I really think legislation is going to continue to be a hot topic. I also see it being particularly important for the energy industry because from my personal experience and background, I'm French American, and France has a law for human rights due diligence called the duty of vigilance. And the first company that law was used against was Total, an oil and gas companies, for some of the issues or impacts that were brought up in Uganda for some of their operations in Uganda. So this law has really been affecting, the first company that the law has affected was Total, and they continue to bring up different cases under that same law. So I think legislation is going to be a hot topic, but not only that, I think also the coordination of all the different legislation, because right now, for instance, there's a law in France, one in Switzerland, one in Norway. So if you're a company like Total, for instance, or any of these big companies, and you operate in many different countries and fall under the jurisdictions of these laws, then you have to report, under each of them. And sometimes it's 80% the same and 20% different, but you have to be up to date with that 20% and know what the difference is and know how you have to do. So I think the coordination is going to require particularly a lot of effort for companies, especially in the energy industry, because they're such international companies. That's going to require a lot of work and a lot of time internally for them to prepare.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.